Before we begin, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss profound, real and disturbing stories like this one. Turn on notifications and become part of our community that explores the darker sides of the human mind and history. Now tell me in the comments, where are you watching this story from? Your place in the world is also part of this narrative. The Winchester mansion never seemed truly alive, only occupied. Erected on California soil, like a body refusing to fall, it breathed creaking, cracking, groaning under the weight of decades of decisions made in silence. There, every crooked corridor was the result of unspoken fear, and every staircase that led nowhere seemed to reflect the broken logic of those who still insisted on continuing. Sarah Winchester was walking slowly down the east hallway that grey morning. There was no hurry. There never was. Time for her didn't move forward. It only accumulated. Her black dress touched the floor like a creeping shadow, and her fingers gripped the handrail tightly, as if the contact with the wood was the only proof that she still existed. On the other side of the house, workers began another day of construction. Hammers echoed like artificial heartbeats. There were no blueprints, no plans, only whispered orders, always delivered at night and executed without question at dawn. The house grew erratically, almost organically, as if reacting to something invisible. The Winchester name carried enough weight to break any man, an empire built on weapons, gunpowder, and anonymous bodies scattered across battlefields, cities, and borders. The family's fortune didn't come from chance, but from deadly efficiency. And yet it was within that mansion that the true price seemed to be paid. Sarah stopped before a newly installed door. Behind it there was nothing, just a solid wall. She knew this, she had ordered it built that way. Even so, she touched the doorknob and turned it slowly. The gesture had no practical purpose. It was a silent, almost unconscious ritual. When the door opened and revealed the immediate end of the space, her eyes showed no surprise, only acceptance. The antagonist in that story wasn't a man, nor a concrete entity. It was guilt, thick, persistent, suffocating. A guilt that manifested itself in the empty spaces of the house, in the abandoned rooms, in the cribs that were never used again. Death hadn't visited the Winchester family just once. It had settled in. Years before, Sarah had been a different person, lighter, more human. The birth of her daughter had promised an ordinary, almost banal future, but the child didn't even survive a few days. Shortly after, her husband followed the same path, consumed by an illness that no amount of money could stop. The house where Sarah lived at that time was too small to contain the grief and too large to hide the silence. It was after these losses that everything changed. Doctors called it a nervous breakdown. Newspapers preferred the term eccentricity. Neither word captured the truth. Sarah didn't scream. She didn't cry in public. She didn't break things. She built. She built like someone trying to plug holes that aren't visible. She built like someone who believes that constant movement could prevent something from catching up with her. The mansion became his closed world. Inside, the past wasn't mentioned, but it was everywhere. In every empty room, in every window positioned to block out the full light. The house seemed deliberately chaotic, as if it had been made to disorient not visitors, but memories. Employees avoided crossing paths with the homeowner. When they did, they described her as a quiet, polite, and distant figure. She never raised her voice. She never explained her orders. She only pointed, wrote short notes, or left subtle marks indicating new changes. The fear didn't stem from aggression. It came from the feeling that this woman had already gone too far to return. At night, when the workers left, the mansion was plunged into an even heavier silence. Sarah walked through dark corridors holding a candle, watching shadows projected onto the walls at impossible angles. The flame flickered, and for brief moments it seemed as if the shadows moved on their own. She didn't run. She didn't flee. She just watched. The central conflict wasn't external. There were no persecutions, no direct threats. The real struggle was happening inside that woman who refused to stop. To stop meant to remember. And to remember meant facing the possibility that none of that, no wall, no room, no staircase, could truly protect her. The mansion grew, but so did the emptiness, and at some point, it became impossible to distinguish where the house ended and where the ruin of the Winchester family itself began. Sarah Winchester's world didn't extend beyond the boundaries of the property. The iron gate marked more than an entrance. It was an invisible border between what could still be controlled and everything she had already lost. Outside, there was California in transformation, with growing cities, expanding trails, optimistic voices speaking of progress. Inside, only the constant sound of construction and the weight of a house that was never finished. The mansion was a strange organism. It didn't follow any known architectural patterns, and that was no accident. Each modification seemed to respond to impulses that no one else understood. Doors appeared where walls had once stood. Staircases ended abruptly, forcing those who climbed them to stop in the void. Windows opened onto other rooms, creating the sensation that the house was observing itself. Nothing there was gratuitous. Everything reflected an attempt to control something that had long since escaped. Sarah rarely ate in the company of others. Her meals were silent, almost ceremonial. The head maid, Clara, watched cautiously. Clara had been at the mansion for years, long enough to notice patterns. Sarah didn't show anger, but there were days when she seemed more distant than usual, as if she were listening to something no one else heard. On those days, new construction orders would arrive the following morning. Clara didn't believe in supernatural stories. She came from a practical family, shaped by hard work. Still, she felt something different in that place. It wasn't explicit fear, but a constant tension, as if any wrong decision could break a fragile balance. The employees spoke little to each other. Many left after a few months. Others stayed out of necessity or curiosity. There was also John Hanson, the foreman of the construction, an experienced man, accustomed to complex projects, but who had never worked without blueprints. At first, he tried to question them. He received only silence in response. He quickly learned that his role was not to understand, but to execute. Even so, something troubled him. It wasn't the lack of structural logic. The mansion, despite everything, remained standing. What disturbed him was the feeling that each new room seemed to respond to an invisible urgency. Sarah watched the workers from a distance, almost always from the balconies. She didn't get directly involved, but she was attentive to everything. She knew exactly where each wall was being erected. At night, I would walk through the newly built areas, touching the still raw wood, breathing in the smell of fresh paint and sawdust. Those spaces were not yet contaminated by memories. For a few hours, they offered relief. The past, however, seeped in persistently. There was one particular room Sarah avoided. It wasn't locked nor hidden. It simply remained untouched. The crib was still there, covered by a thin sheet. No one dared clean that room without explicit permission that never came. It was the only space in the house that didn't grow, didn't transform. It remained frozen in time, like an open wound she refused to close. The Winchester family's money made everything possible. Materials arrived without delay. Workers were easily hired. Local authorities turned a blind eye to irregularities. The surname opened doors and silenced questions. Yet this same fortune carried a stigma. Some employees whispered about the origin of that money, weapons, deaths, wars, comments that never reached Sarah's ears, or perhaps they did, but it no longer mattered. American culture of that period valued growth, expansion, and overcoming limitations. Sarah seemed to embody this mentality in a distorted way. While the country moved outward, she moved inward, building layer upon layer of space, as if she could bury the past under wood and nails. The characters around her orbited her presence without ever truly touching her. Clara saw a broken yet inaccessible woman. Hansen saw an eccentric yet determined client. The others saw only the silent boss who paid well and asked for strange things. No one saw the whole person. And perhaps that was the greatest tragedy. Sarah Winchester was surrounded by people, but utterly alone within the very world she had created. The mansion continued to grow, and with it, the distance between Sarah and any possibility of returning to normalcy. Each new room was further proof that this house was not just a refuge, it was a direct extension of her mind. And the more the house expanded, the more evident it became that there wasn't enough space to bury everything that needed to be forgotten. The conflict began to intensify when the routine, previously predictable in its strangeness, started to show flaws. Small, almost imperceptible, but enough to shatter the illusion of control that Sarah Winchester had so carefully constructed. That week, the sound of hammering stopped earlier than usual on 2 consecutive days. Hansen noticed the problem before anyone else. The workers were making mistakes. Not common technical errors, but mistakes of attention. Walls erected in the wrong place, beams misaligned, doors installed without prior order. Experienced men seemed confused, irritable, as if the environment were invisibly wearing them down. Sarah noticed the change immediately. She didn't complain. She didn't punish. She simply began to circulate more during the day, something she rarely did. Her silent presence in the corridors under construction caused an immediate discomfort. The men avoided meeting her gaze, although she rarely looked anyone directly in the eye. The conflict wasn't in words or direct confrontations, but in the pressure that accumulated in each newly created space. That same week, one of the workers fell from a staircase that ended in nothing. There were no screams, only the dry sound of the impact. The man survived but left the mansion the next day, limping, without asking for compensation, without looking back. The incident was not officially commented on. Still, it spread among the others as a silent confirmation that something was wrong. Sarah walked to the accident site that night. She observed the staircase for long minutes. She showed no shock. The next day, she simply ordered that another staircase be built over the old one, completely changing the access to the upper floor. That was how she dealt with problems. She didn't solve them. She buried them. The past also began to creep in more aggressively. Old letters reappeared on her desk, mixed in with recent documents. No one had put them there. At least, that's what everyone said. Clara found one open, the yellowed paper displaying delicate handwriting that Sarah would immediately recognize. Her daughter's name was written there. When Sarah saw the letter, she didn't react. She simply closed the envelope and put it in her dress pocket. That night, she ordered the construction of a new, narrow and long corridor to begin, connecting areas that didn't need to be linked. The work started before dawn. The central conflict was beginning to take shape. No matter how hard Sarah tried to move forward, something always pulled her back. The house, once an instrument of escape, was becoming a cruel mirror. Each attempt to push away the pain resulted in new distortions, new risks, new losses. The supporting characters began to feel the weight of this transformation. Clara started having trouble sleeping. She reported recurring dreams of endless corridors and doors that wouldn't open. Hansen, in turn, began drinking more at night, not out of explicit fear, but because of the feeling of participating in something that went beyond the limits of reason. Tensions rose when a municipal inspector appeared unexpectedly. The ongoing construction had drawn attention. He toured the mansion, accompanied by Hansen, noting irregularities, frowning at useless staircases and interior windows. When he requested to speak with the owner, he was informed that she did not receive unannounced visitors. Sarah watched the man from a distant balcony. She didn't come down. She didn't intervene. The next day, the inspector didn't return. No notification was issued. The Winchester money, once again, had solved the problem. Still, the feeling of threat remained. For the first time, outside forces had gotten too close. Sarah's inner conflict began to manifest physically. She started walking faster, as if she were always running late. Her eyes had deep, dark circles. On some nights, she would stay awake until dawn, wandering around the house without a candle, guided only by her memory of the spaces. One night, she mistakenly entered the room she had been avoiding. The crib was still there. The sheet had slipped, revealing the intact wood. Sarah didn't touch anything. She stood at the door for too long. When she left, her step was no longer so steady. The following morning, he ordered the construction of another floor above that wing. The conflict reached a new level. The house was no longer sufficient to contain everything that arose. Each solution created new cracks. Each advance brought unexpected consequences. The mansion began to become dangerous not only for those who worked there, but for the woman who ran it. And for the first time, it became clear that continuing to build might no longer be a choice, but a desperate necessity from which Sarah could no longer escape. As the main conflict intensified, smaller parallel stories began to silently intertwine with the routine of the mansion, creating a web of tensions that could no longer be ignored. None of them existed in isolation. They all orbited the same central force: Sarah Winchester's inability to break the cycle she herself fostered. Clara began taking on tasks that weren't originally her responsibility. She started reorganizing schedules, switching employees from specific wings, and preventing the same workers from spending too much time in the oldest corridors. It wasn't a direct order from Sarah, it was an instinct. Some spaces seemed to affect people more. Men who worked there became restless, distracted, and prone to mistakes. Clara didn't talk about it aloud, but she acted as if she knew exactly where one shouldn't linger for too long. Hansen noticed the changes. The foreman, always pragmatic, began to keep personal records of the construction. They weren't blueprints. He knew that wouldn't be accepted, but private notes, dates, constructed areas, accidents that occurred, changes requested without explanation. For the first time, he questioned whether that never-ending construction could one day collapse, not due to structural failure, but due to the accumulation of decisions made without apparent logic. Time pressure began to subtly creep in. Sarah started demanding that certain constructions be completed within impossible deadlines. A hallway needed to be finished before dawn. A new room couldn't wait until the next day. The pace of construction accelerated, and with it, the risks. Exhausted workers made mistakes. Materials were used haphazardly. Care gave way to urgency. Meanwhile, a silent subplot unfolded outside the mansion. Neighbors began to talk, not about ghosts or curses, but about the practical absurdity of the constant construction. A house that was never finished, a woman who never received visitors, a property that seemed to live outside of ordinary time. Small rumors spread, and although they didn't represent an immediate threat, they created a feeling of invisible siege. Inside the house, another complexity emerged. The mansion itself began to challenge its inhabitants. Newly created passageways confused even those who had built them. A door that led to the kitchen one day seemed to lead to another location the following week, after further alterations. The house changed too quickly to be assimilated. The space was no longer reliable. Sarah felt it. She didn't verbalize it, but she adapted her habits. She began to mentally mark safe routes. She avoided specific areas at certain times. There were moments when she would stop in the middle of a corridor, as if she had forgotten why she was there. On those occasions, she would put her hand on the wall and take a deep breath, waiting for the feeling of orientation to return. The most delicate subplot, however, was internal. Sarah was beginning to falter in her own method. Building no longer brought the immediate relief it once did. The nighttime silence grew more oppressive. The distant sound of creaking wood seemed to carry intention. There were no clear hallucinations, no visions, only the persistent feeling that something was watching her, not from outside, but from within the house itself. Clara tried to intervene only once. She cautiously suggested that perhaps it would be wise to halt the work for a few days. The response was not in words. The following morning, Clara found her room moved to another wing without prior notice, not as explicit punishment, but as a silent reminder that decisions were not shared. The subplots slowly converged: the workers' exhaustion, increasing external surveillance, the instability of the physical space, and Sarah's psychological weariness. Everything was moving toward an inevitable point. There was no more room for simple adjustments. Each new construction seemed to push the story toward a narrower limit. The pressure of time was becoming clear. Something needed to happen before the mansion, or whoever lived in it, completely collapsed. And while everyone tried to adapt, the house continued to grow, indifferent, absorbing mistakes, fears, and hasty decisions, as if it were preparing to demand a higher price. The event that definitively changed the course of history was not a visible collapse, nor a public scandal. It was something smaller, and for that very reason, irreversible. That morning, Sarah woke up earlier than usual. There were no construction noises, no wind, no external stimulus to justify waking her. Even so, she opened her eyes with the certainty that she needed to get up. She dressed without turning on the light and left the room as if following a call that doesn't allow for delay. He walked through old corridors, ignoring the newer ones. His steps led him to a wing that had remained virtually untouched for months. The air there seemed heavier, laden with an old smell of aged wood and dust. When he reached the end of the corridor, he stopped before a simple door, unadorned, unmarked. A door that had not been part of the recent plans. She didn't remember having it built. The doorknob was cold. Turning it, Sarah encountered something that had never happened before. The space behind that door didn't match her memory. The room was small, dimly lit by the moonlight streaming through a narrow window. In the center there was a chair. On it, an object that made her body react before her mind could comprehend it. It was a mourning veil. Old, delicately folded. Sarah took a step back. Her heart raced, and for the first time in years, she couldn't immediately move to correct the situation. No order could erase it. No new construction could bury what was before her eyes. The veil was hers. From her husband's funeral, the turning point wasn't the object itself, but the absolute realization that the house had escaped his control. This wasn't a memory stored in a forgotten drawer. It was something that had emerged without command, without planning, without conscious intention. The mansion not only reflected his mind, now it seemed to act on its own. Sarah left the room without closing the door. The following morning, Hansen was given an unusual order. No construction was to begin that day. The workers, confused, awaited instructions that never came. Silence spread across the property like a physical presence. For the first time in decades, the mansion was not growing. This interruption had an immediate effect. Clara noticed that the hallways seemed different, not physically, but in the way sound traveled. Each footstep echoed louder. Each door creaked like a warning. The house, deprived of constant movement, became impossible to ignore. Sarah spent the entire day in a single room. Not the avoided bedroom, nor the office, but an intermediate room with no defined function. Sitting motionless, she stared at the opposite wall for hours. She didn't reflect in words. She didn't mentally reconstruct the past. She only felt the full weight of everything that had been pushed forward without ever being resolved. That night, she returned to the room with the veil. This time, he approached the chair. He touched the fabric with his fingertips. There was no relief, no catharsis, only a cruel clarity. Building had not been a shield, but a postponement. Each wall erected had served to push the inevitable further away, until there was no more room. The unexpected event wasn't supernatural. There were no apparitions, no voices. The shock came from the realization that absolute control was an illusion maintained at the cost of her own sanity. Sarah understood with painful clarity that the house didn't protect her from pain, it only kept her prisoner of it. The following morning, construction resumed, but something had changed. The orders were no longer impulsive. They were meticulous, almost cold. Instead of expanding, Sarah began to modify, sealing passages, reducing access, creating internal barriers. The mansion stopped growing outwards and began to close in on itself. That was the real turning point. It was no longer an escape. It was containment. The workers felt the difference. Hansen realized that there was now a harsh logic behind the changes, not functional, but defensive. Clara noticed that certain areas had become completely isolated. The house was being reorganized not to confuse, but to create boundaries. Sarah had understood something essential and terrible. She could not escape the past, but perhaps she could imprison it. And in making that decision, she sealed the fate not only of the mansion, but of herself. Sarah Winchester's decision reverberated through the mansion like a contained tremor. There was no formal announcement, no explanation. Still, everyone felt the change. What had once been relentless growth had transformed into a careful, almost surgical process of closure. The house was no longer moving forward. It was reorganizing itself. The consequences were immediate. Workers accustomed to opening up spaces began to block them. Doors were sealed from the inside. Staircases had their last steps removed. Interior windows were covered with thick panels, preventing any line of sight between certain rooms. The mansion, once an expanding labyrinth, became a succession of isolated compartments. Hansen felt the weight of the change as an omen. The defensive logic of the new orders unsettled him more than the old meaninglessness. Now there was intention. Not a functional intention, but a strategy. He realized he was no longer building an eccentric house. He was helping to create a containment structure. Something was being kept away, uninvited. Clara reacted differently. The isolation of entire wings brought a paradoxical sense of relief. Certain corridors, previously a source of constant tension, became inaccessible. The silence there was absolute. Yet this relief was accompanied by a growing unease. What exactly was being isolated? Spaces, memories, or Sarah herself? The mistress changed her habits. She became even more reserved, but now with a visible purpose. Her daily routes were now limited to a few areas. She avoided newly sealed zones with strict discipline. When she crossed paths with employees, her gaze didn't show confusion. It showed vigilance, as if she were constantly assessing whether something had slipped through the cracks. External reactions also began to manifest. The interruption of the expansion drew attention. Suppliers noticed smaller orders. Local authorities, previously indifferent, once again showed curiosity, not out of concern for safety, but out of strangeness. A project that never seemed to end now appeared to be contracting. A new inspector arrived weeks later. He didn't find the chaos he expected. The mansion remained irregular, but recent changes made access to problematic areas difficult. Locked doors, dead ends, blocked paths. Everything seemed deliberately arranged to limit observation. The inspector left with more questions than answers, and no clear infractions to record. Inside the house, the emotional consequences were more profound. Sarah began sleeping less, not from diffuse anxiety, but from conscious vigilance. The confinement demanded constant attention. Any unexpected sound made her get up. She walked through the permitted areas with firm steps, like someone patrolling fragile territory. There was no more room for distraction. One night, she heard a noise coming from a sealed wing. Not a loud bang, just a dry crackling sound, like wood adjusting itself. Sarah stopped. She waited. There was no repeat. The next day, she had the insulation of that specific area reinforced, even without any apparent explanation. The house responded, and she reacted immediately. Human relationships suffered inevitable strain. Clara began to avoid unnecessary conversations. Hansen started delegating more, distancing himself emotionally from the project. Some workers resigned, citing discomfort without being able to explain exactly why. Those who remained learned not to ask questions. The most significant consequence, however, was internal. Sarah no longer built to escape. She built to maintain boundaries. This constant effort took a silent toll. Her body seemed more rigid, her movements more restrained. Every decision was weighed, measured, precise. There was no more impulsiveness, only resistance. The past, now confined, did not disappear. It remained pressing against the invisible walls she had erected, and the firmer the containment, the more evident it became that any failure could be devastating. The mansion was quieter than ever. And in that silence, the consequences of Sarah's decision began to accumulate, preparing the ground for something that could not be contained forever. The next phase brought no relief. It brought demands. With the mansion under control, Sarah Winchester faced something she had always avoided: the need to act without resorting to excess. There were no more new corridors to organize, nor wings to expand. Every decision now had real weight, immediate consequences. Overcoming this would not come from a grand change, but from relentless discipline. She established strict routines, set times for walking, for checking permitted areas, for resting. Even when sleep wouldn't come, the growth she was forcing wasn't emotional in the usual sense. It was functional. Sarah needed to prove to herself that she was still in control of something beyond construction. She needed to demonstrate control over her own body, over her own steps. New challenges arose from this limitation. One morning, Sarah realized that one of the secure access points was compromised. A sealed door showed signs of wear. It wasn't an immediate threat, but it was a flaw. Before, she would have ordered a new barrier. Now, she couldn't. Any alteration had to respect the restricted map she herself had imposed. The solution required precision, not expansion. She closely monitored the repairs. She observed every nail, every adjustment. Not out of distrust of the workers, but because she needed to be present. For the first time in a long time, she didn't completely delegate. This constant presence forced her to remain there, in that moment, with no possible escape. Hansen noticed the difference. Sarah no longer seemed to react on impulse. She assessed, she waited, she chose. This made the work slower and more tense. A mistake would no longer be buried by another construction. It needed to be corrected definitively. Sarah's personal growth began to manifest itself in an almost imperceptible way. She learned to tolerate small pauses, moments when nothing was done, when the house remained still. These intervals were uncomfortable, but no longer unbearable. She remained seated, breathing in a controlled manner, waiting for the impulse to pass without acting on it. Clara noticed first. Sarah no longer jumped up abruptly during the night at the slightest noise. She still woke up, still heard, but didn't always move. Sometimes she remained lying down, her eyes open in the dark, enduring the sensation without immediately translating it into action. This did not mean healing, it meant resistance. The past continued to press down, but now it found a firmer structure, not because it was weaker, but because Sarah had strengthened her inner boundaries. Each night, endured without change, was a small, silent victory. There was a decisive moment, discreet but revealing. As she walked down an old hallway, Sarah realized she had taken the wrong path. Something common before, rare now. She stopped. Instead of correcting herself immediately, she remained there for a few seconds. She acknowledged her mistake. She went back the same way. She didn't ask for anything to be changed. She didn't punish the house for confusing her. This simple choice represented a profound change. Growth didn't come from eliminating pain, but from the ability to get through it without falling apart. Sarah was slowly learning to coexist with what had been lost. She didn't accept it, not yet, But she no longer needed to crush everything around her to keep functioning. The challenges that followed tested this evolution. Minor setbacks, delays, imperfections. The mansion now contained no longer offered endless options for correction. Each flaw demanded direct confrontation. Sarah responded with restrained firmness, without resorting to her old obsession. Her body, however, was taking its toll. Constant fatigue, persistent pain, clear signs of wear and tear. Still, she didn't give up. She adjusted her pace, accepted her limitations. She learned to keep going even without her full strength. That was true growth, moving forward without the support of excess. The house reflected this change. Less noise, less urgency, more rigidity, more sustained silence. A silence that was not empty, but charged with conscious effort. Sarah Winchester hadn't gotten over the past, but she had learned something essential. She no longer needed to run from it, and this newfound ability inevitably led her to the moment when everything that had been contained would need to be faced all at once. The preparation didn't come as an announcement. It came as an inevitable convergence. With the mansion now rigidly delineated, the subplots began to close, almost out of exhaustion. Remaining workers were gradually dismissed. Hansen reduced the staff to the bare minimum necessary for maintenance. There were no more major interventions, only minor repairs. The work that had defined decades of everyone's lives there was approaching a static state, something that no one ever believed possible. This reduction accelerated the pace of events. Fewer people meant less noise, less distraction, less room for Sarah to hide behind constant activity. The silence, now continuous, became a daily test. Clara was the first to leave. There was no conflict, no emotional farewells. She respectfully asked to be excused, explaining that she needed to leave that place before something inside her also closed off forever. Sarah listened in silence. She didn't try to stop her. She simply nodded. Clara's departure wasn't a practical loss. It was symbolic. The last regular human connection was broken. Hansen stayed on only out of technical obligation. His relationship with Sarah had become strictly functional. They both knew the end was approaching, although neither dared to name exactly what it was. Inside the house, Sarah began to review the sealed areas. Not to reopen them, but to ensure they were complete. She walked along the permitted boundaries as if traversing the edges of a carefully covered abyss. At each critical point, she checked locks, reinforcements, closures. Everything needed to be secure before what was to come. The tension grew, not because of new events, but because of their absence. Nothing happened. No inexplicable noise, no structural failure, no emergency. This absolute calm was more disturbing than any previous chaos. It was the kind of silence that precedes irreversible decisions. Sarah's body felt the weight of this preparation. The fatigue became constant. Her hands trembled slightly at rest. Walking required more effort. Still, she persisted. There was no escape possible anymore. Everything converged on a single internal point that she had been postponing from the beginning. On a particularly cold night, Sarah carried a candle to the oldest wing of the mansion, not the sealed one, but the one that preceded all the major transformations. The space was simple, almost ordinary. There, the house still felt like a home. That contrast was enough to make her stop. She sat on a wooden bench and remained there for hours. She didn't plan. She didn't revise decisions. She simply waited. For the first time, she allowed time to pass without trying to control it. This waiting period was the real preparation. The subplots had served their purpose. The workers were gone, the bonds dissolved. The house was contained, and Sarah had learned to endure the silence. There were no distractions left. No intermediaries remained. The final confrontation would not be external. The following morning, Sarah made a decision that sealed the deal, leading to the climax. He ordered Hansen to permanently cease all activity at the mansion. No maintenance beyond the essentials, no modifications, no future adaptations. The house would remain exactly as it was. Hansen tried to argue. For the first time in years, he spoke of natural wear and tear, of future risks. Sarah listened and responded only with a firm look. It wasn't denial, it was closure. When Hansen left, the iron gate slammed shut behind him with a definitive sound. Sarah was alone. The preparations were complete. Everything that could be organized, contained, and controlled was done. The mansion would not change anymore. It would not offer new exits. It would not absorb new decisions. What remained now was to confront what no wall had been able to eliminate. The climax wouldn't come from visible explosions or collapses. It would come from the clash between everything that was built and everything that was avoided. And Sarah Winchester knew, with an almost tranquil clarity, that there was nowhere else to go. The climax didn't begin with an event. It began with a choice. That night, Sarah Winchester carried no candle. She walked through the mansion guided only by memory and the tactile sensation of the walls beneath her fingers. Each step was deliberate. There was no hurry, but there was determination. The house was still, absolutely silent, as if waiting. She walked to the oldest sealed wing, the one that held the first containment measures, the toughest decisions. Before the last closed door, she stopped. That barrier represented everything that had been avoided, suppressed, pushed away over decades. There was no noise behind it, no external sign. The confrontation would be internal or it wouldn't happen at all. Sarah opened the door. The space was not as she had expected. There were no specific objects nor material traces of the past. The room was simple, almost empty. What made it unbearable was the brightness. Nothing there distracted the attention. There was nowhere to look but inward. She went inside and closed the door behind her. For a moment, the sensation was one of vertigo, not physical, but mental. All the decisions made over the years, every wall, every useless staircase, every sleepless night, converged at a single point. The mansion, once a labyrinth, had become a straight line pointing directly to that choice. Sarah sat down on the floor. There was no explosive emotional collapse, no convulsive crying. The climax manifested not as loss of control, but as total exhaustion. The body gave way before the mind. She leaned her back against the wall and closed her eyes, allowing the memories to surface without resistance. The cradle, the silence following her husband's illness, the first night of construction, when she believed that the constant movement would save her. Everything came without distortion, without the fog that previously required more walls to be contained. For the first time, Sarah didn't react by trying to correct, modify, or contain it. She remained. The climax was this, the brutal acceptance that nothing had been resolved because nothing needed to be erased, only acknowledged. The protagonist's transformation happened there, on that cold floor, in that functionless room. Sarah understood something she had always avoided. The mansion had never been a prison for the past. It had been a prison for herself. Every confusing corridor, every excessive decision had served to keep her moving, preventing her from stopping in the only place that mattered. She took a deep breath. The gesture was difficult, as if the air had weight. Still, she remained. Hours passed, perhaps minutes. Time in that place no longer held any meaning. When Sarah opened her eyes again, something had changed. Not the past, but her relationship with it. She stood up with difficulty. Her body protested, but she obeyed. She opened the door and left the sealed wing, leaving it open, not out of carelessness, but as a conscious decision. As she walked back down the hallways, Sarah noticed something surprising. The house no longer seemed hostile, not welcoming, but neutral. For the first time, she didn't feel it as an extension of her fragmented mind. It was just a space, large, confusing, silent, but separate from her. The climax was reached when Sarah made the final decision. Reaching the center of the mansion, he stopped before the main staircase, the same staircase that had been modified countless times. He touched the handrail, observed the uneven steps, and instead of ordering any corrections, he simply climbed up. At the top, there was no revelation, no grand symbol, just an ordinary corridor leading to empty rooms, and that was enough. The transformation was complete. Sarah Winchester hadn't conquered the past, nor had she completely freed herself from it. But she had broken the cycle. She would no longer build to escape. She would no longer seal to contain. The mansion would remain as it was. A monument not to madness, but to the cost of avoiding confrontation for too long. The central conflict was resolved, not by eliminating the pain, but by the conscious choice to bear it without letting it dictate every step. The climax didn't destroy the house. She destroyed the illusion that sustained her. The days that followed the silent confrontation brought no immediate visible changes. The mansion remained exactly as it was, vast, irregular, marked by decisions accumulated over decades. However, something fundamental had shifted, not in the walls, but in the way Sarah Winchester inhabited that space. She came to occupy only a few central areas of the house, not out of fear of the others, but by choice. The outer corridors remained open, yet untouched. There was no longer any need to seal or renovate them. Their mere existence no longer demanded any reaction. The mansion had ceased to be a constant battlefield and had become a stable territory, albeit one laden with history. Sarah resumed simple habits she had abandoned long ago. She sat down for full meals, even alone. She read for short periods without the urge to interrupt her reading to dictate some change. She slept little, but she slept better. When she woke during the night, she accepted the silence without interpreting it as a threat. The ultimate consequences of their actions became clear as the weeks passed. The house, once defined by its relentless growth, was now aging. Natural creaks emerged, small flaws appeared and were corrected only when necessary. Nothing was exaggerated, nothing was avoided. To the few who still observed from the outside, the Winchester mansion began to look exactly as it had always been, an architectural enigma, the result of incomprehensible choices. But this external perception no longer mattered. The public narrative had never reflected the internal reality, and Sarah had finally accepted that. The most significant thing was the long-term effect on herself. The pain didn't disappear. The losses didn't become any lighter. There were still days when certain memories surfaced with unexpected force. The difference lay in the response. Sarah no longer rushed to neutralize them with action. She remained still. She breathed. She let them pass without demanding a physical solution. The mansion, in this new state, became an involuntary record of his journey. Each interrupted staircase, each useless door, each functionless corridor was concrete evidence of the price of avoiding confrontation. Not as an accusation, but as testimony. Sarah finally understood that she didn't need to destroy the house to move on, nor did she need to justify it. It existed, as did her story, as did her flaws. The world outside those gates continued to move forward, indifferent. New generations would emerge, new narratives would be created. The mansion would remain a fixed point in time, observed, interpreted, distorted. And Sarah Winchester would remain there, not as a prisoner of the past, but as someone who had finally accepted living with it, without allowing it to define her every future step. The conclusion was not one of complete liberation. It was something rarer, imperfect, yet conscious balance. Years later, when other people walked through the corridors of the Winchester mansion, they found a place that seemed suspended in time. There were no signs of complete abandonment, nor of renovation. Only permanence. Sarah Winchester died there, quietly, without grand announcements or final explanations. The house did not grow after her death. Nor was it repaired. It remained as it was, with its interrupted staircases and useless doors, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a record of a past life trying to continue. To an outside observer, the mansion is an enigma. For those who understand its history, it's a silent warning. There are pains that no building can hide forever. If this story touched you, reflect for a moment on what it reveals beyond the walls of the mansion. How many times do we try to create distractions to avoid facing what hurts us? How many repeated decisions only postpone the inevitable? Share in the comments what struck you most about this narrative and how you interpreted the final silence of the Winchester house. Your reading may be different from someone else's, and that's precisely what makes these stories come alive. If you enjoy dense, realistic, and disturbing narratives, subscribe to the channel and follow the upcoming stories.